What if the most dangerous object in the European theater was not a tank, but a weathered rifle hidden in a Canadian attic for 80 years? Found at a rural auction, this scarred Lee Enfield held secrets that rewrite the history of the Great Crusade and the journey of a warrior whose the world forgot. In the autumn of 2024, at a small estate auction in rural Manitoba, a heavy Lee Enfield No. 4 bolt-action rifle was placed on a velvet-covered table, its walnut stock scarred by 1,000 scratches that seemed to whisper of a frozen past. The rifle belonged to a woman whose name appeared on no official heroes list and in no victory parade. Her name was Mary Tallgrass, a member of the Cree nation who had vanished into the biting winds of the north as soon as the peace treaties were signed. Historians had long dismissed the legends of a female Indigenous marksman who haunted the Ardennes Forest as mere campfire folklore, a ghost of the woods, invented to keep shivering young soldiers awake on guard duty. But as the auctioneer's assistant handled the weapon, he noticed a subtle, unnatural weight in the buttplate, a slight imbalance that suggested the wood was not solid. When the brass plate was carefully removed, it revealed a vacuum-sealed chamber that had not been opened since the winter of 1945. Inside that hollowed-out space, the air of the mid-20th century seemed to spill out, carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of cedar and dried mountain wildflowers. There were no notches for lives taken, no grim tallies of the fallen, and no spent casings. Instead, the historians found 3 small, perfectly preserved items wrapped in a scrap of faded deer hide. A hand-carved wooden bird no larger than a thumb, a tarnished silver locket containing a photograph of a smiling German child, and a tiny bundle of sweetgrass tied with a blue ribbon. The discovery sent a shockwave through the room, for it contradicted every tactical manual ever written about the cold, detached nature of the long-range scout. The experts realized they were looking at the soul of a warrior who had fought while refusing to let the darkness consume her. Long before she was a phantom in the frozen ridges of Europe, Mary Tallgrass was a child of the quiet places, where the only language spoken was the rustle of the wind through the black spruce. In the vast, sprawling muskeg of northern Manitoba, time did not move by the ticking of a clock, but by the migration of the caribou and the shifting colors of the great northern lights. It was here, amidst the scent of damp earth and crushed pine needles, that a young Cree girl learned that the world is never truly silent if you know how to listen with your heart. Her father did not teach her to hunt for sport. He taught her that to take a breath from the forest was a sacred exchange, a balance that must be respected. Under his guidance, Mary learned to sit so still that songbirds would land on her shoulders. She practiced the art of the long view, training her eyes to detect the slight flicker of a deer's ear through a dense thicket 300 yards away. While other children played, Mary spent her afternoons tracking the movement of shadows across the snow. By the time the global conflict reached the north, Mary had developed an almost supernatural connection to her surroundings. The Canadian military recruiters were initially skeptical of the small, soft-spoken woman who stood barely 5 feet tall. They were looking for rugged men, seasoned by iron and fire, not a girl who looked as though she might be carried away by a strong gust of wind. However, a single afternoon at a makeshift shooting range changed the course of her life forever. As the officers watched, Mary took a standard-issue rifle and treated it with the same reverence she gave her father's old wooden bow. Without the use of a telescopic sight, she placed 5 rounds into point, a target so distant the officers had to use binoculars to see it. The lead recruiter realized that Mary possessed something that could not be manufactured in a factory. She had the patience of the mountains and a spirit that remained unshaken by the chaos of the world. As she boarded the train, she carried her father's final blessing, to remain like the deep water under the ice, calm, hidden, and true. The journey from the Manitoba muskeg to the eastern seaboard was a jarring transition for Mary. She moved from a world of silence to a world of screeching iron and soot-choked cities. On the troop transport ship across the Atlantic, she spent her nights on the upper deck, away from the cramped, oil-smelling barracks below. She watched the dark waves, learning to read the white foam just as she had read the snowdrifts back home. The other soldiers, boys from the prairies and the fishing villages, were loud with a nervous energy, but Mary was a well of stillness. She began to understand that her role in this war would be to act as the eyes of the people, a responsibility that felt as ancient as the stars above. The rugged, mist-shrouded cliffs of Loch Elort, Scotland, served as the ultimate proving ground for the most elite marksman in the British Empire. But none of the instructors were prepared for Mary. The training was designed to break the spirit and rebuild it into a cold instrument of military precision. Yet Mary moved through the obstacle courses as if she were walking through an ancient cathedral. When it came time for the first live fire exercise on the long-distance range, a hush fell over the assembled men. The targets were positioned 500 yards away, obscured by shifting fog and the unpredictable Scottish winds that usually baffled even the most seasoned hunters. Mary simply closed her eyes for a single heartbeat, feeling the moisture in the air and the rhythm of the heather swaying at her feet. With 5 rhythmic pulls of the point trigger, she achieved a grouping so tight it appeared as though only a single hole had been pierced through the center of the canvas. The head instructor, a veteran who had seen the worst of the trenches, realized he was looking at a master of an older, more profound discipline. Mary refused to use the standard-issue camouflage burlap, which he found smelled of factory oil and chemicals. Instead, she spent her evenings in the hills, gathering local moss and old twine to weave a shroud that made her vanish into the landscape. During the grueling nighttime navigation tests, Mary's performance was nothing short of legendary. While the men fumbled with their luminous compasses and crinkling paper maps, Mary moved by the smell of the damp peat and the subtle change in the air's temperature as it moved around the hills. She often reached the finish line 30 minutes before the next scout, her boots perfectly clean while the others were caked in mud. When asked how she found her way, she merely whispered that the hills were talking, and she had simply chosen to listen. This was the first time her commanders began to suspect they were not just training a soldier, but a force of nature that existed beyond their tactical manuals. The men began to call her the Ghost. She would often participate in nighttime navigation exercises, appearing suddenly at the objective point without having made a single sound. Her instructors noted in her file that her accuracy was not merely a matter of optics, but a form of heightened intuition. Despite the growing legend of her skills, Mary remained an outsider, often found sitting alone by the fire, her fingers tracing the smooth grain of her rifle's stock. She knew that the competition of the training camp was merely a prelude to a much darker theatre. The winds of the highlands were beginning to carry the distant scent of iron and ash, signaling that her journey into the heart of the conflict was about to begin. By December of 1944, the Ardennes Forest had become a cathedral of iron and ice, where the air seemed to freeze the breath inside a soldier's lungs. While the machinery of the modern world groaned and stalled in the sub-zero temperatures, Mary moved through the white-draped pines like a drift of smoke. The Battle of the Bulge was a chaotic collision of steel, yet amidst the thunder of the panzer divisions, Mary was assigned to hold a nameless ridge alone as a solitary lookout. She didn't view the frost as an enemy. She used it as a shroud, allowing the falling flakes to coat her hand-woven camouflage until she was indistinguishable from the landscape. The sensory world of the Ardennes was a study in violent contrasts. There was the sharp, acrid stench of diesel rising from the valleys below, and then there was the clean, sharp scent of the frozen spruce needles right beneath her nose. Through her scope, Mary watched the movements of the opposing forces, but she saw more than just uniforms. In the quiet of her vigil, the propaganda began to crack, replaced by the realization that the forest was filled with frightened children far from home. It was here, in the freezing dark, that Mary took a small, hand-carved wooden bird from her pack and tucked it into the hidden compartment of her rifle stock, the first of her secret anchors to a world that wasn't broken by, as the blizzard intensified, the ridge became a place of absolute isolation. Mary had to slow her breathing until her heart beat like a hibernating bear, conserving every ounce of warmth. She watched as a young German patrol, no older than 18, sat around a small, smoky fire in a hollow below her. They were huddled together, sharing a single piece of hard bread, their faces pale and drawn. She could have called in an artillery strike that would have in seconds, but she saw her own brothers in their tired eyes. She realized that the war was a machine that ate the young, and she vowed that she would only pull her trigger when it was absolutely necessary to protect the light. Her reputation grew among the Allied troops. Men spoke of a guardian in the white who warned them of incoming shells by the subtle shift in the wind. But the greatest test of her resolve was the arrival of a specific shadow in the woods, one that was hunting for her with the same predatory patience she possessed. Deep in the heart of the blizzard, a new kind of silence began to fall over the ridge. Another pair of eyes, trained in the elite academies of Berlin, was now scanning the tree line, searching for the slightest ripple in the snow that would betray the ghost of the Ardennes. He was the pride of the Berlin Academy, a master marksman sent to the one they called the Indian woman. This was no longer a battle of battalions. It had narrowed down to a silent 48-hour standoff between two individuals who could both disappear into a single shadow. Mary Tallgrass felt his presence before she saw him. a subtle disturbance that felt like a cold draft in a closed room. Her adversary, Kurt, moved with a mechanical perfection, his eyes scanning for the telltale glint of a glass lens. But Mary kept her scope covered with a piece of fine mesh she had darkened with soot, relying on her ability to sense the weight of the air. For 2 days, neither moved. The temperatures plummeted so low that the oil in their rifles began to thicken like honey, yet Mary remained a statue of ice. At the 36th hour, a break in the clouds allowed a single finger of moonlight to touch a ruined farmhouse. In that moment, Kurt shifted his weight. Mary saw the displacement of a single puff of snow, and in that instant she had him in her sights. Her finger tightened, but the wind carried the sound of a soft, ragged cough from the ruins. Through her lens, the monster became clear. Kurt had removed his glove to adjust his bolt, and his hand was trembling violently with advanced frostbite. The boy was so young, his uniform seemed a size too large, and he was desperately trying to stay awake in a war that had already forgotten him. Mary realized that if she pulled the trigger, she would be a boy who was already being claimed by the winter. In a move that defied every military doctrine, Mary did not fire. Instead, she wrapped a stone in a piece of her bright blue ribbon and hurled it toward the farmhouse wall. The sharp crack startled the young German, causing him to duck and retreat into the cellar. She had revealed her presence to save a life rather than take one. As Mary watched his retreating shadow, she reached for her rifle and opened the small compartment, placing a second item inside, a silver locket she had found near the ruins, as a witness to the mercy she had just shown. The shots that echoed from the high ridges of the Ardennes did not always signal a Laufen. They were the sounds of a hidden guardian, guiding the lost back toward the light. Historians who later scrutinized the maps discovered that Mary Tallgrass was using her weapon as a tool of redirection. When disoriented Allied paratroopers wandered toward a hidden nest of machine guns, a precise shot would ring out, not hitting a person, but striking a metal signpost with such resonance that the soldiers would halt and change their path. She chose to create ripples of preservation. In one instance, she spent 3 days watching a farmhouse where a local family was hiding while an enemy patrol occupied the floors above. Instead of engaging in a direct confrontation that would have resulted in the end for everyone, she used her rifle to systematically disable the enemy's transport vehicles from a distance, forcing the patrol to abandon the position on foot. Because she never revealed her location, the family remained safe, never knowing they were saved by a woman who refused to be a taker of breath. During this time, she added a tiny bundle of sweetgrass to the secret chamber in her stock, a fragrant contrast to the acrid smell of gunpowder that saturated the air. The farmhouse was home to an elderly couple and their 3 grandchildren. From her perch, Mary could see them through a cracked window, huddled around a cold hearth. She saw the grandmother surrender her shawl to keep the youngest child from shivering. The contrast was stark. The heavy clanking metal of the enemy's armored cars outside versus the soft, fragile pulse of life within those stone walls. Mary took a third treasure that day, a small piece of blue ribbon from a discarded package in the yard, and tucked it into her rifle. It was a promise to herself that the machine would not win. The brass buttplate was becoming a reliquary, a sacred space where the humanity of the war was being preserved in secret. While the world saw a terrifying phantom, Mary was quietly building a bridge back to the person she used to be. But the greatest test of this silent mercy was yet to come, at a narrow stone crossing where the weight of an entire division was about to collide with the fragile hope of the innocent. As the retreating lines grew more desperate, Mary realized that her role as a shepherd was about to move from the shadows into the path of a mounting storm. A single bridge stood as the only escape route for refugees, and the iron tracks of a panzer division were already vibrating through the frozen earth. A single stone bridge was the only thing standing between 300 terrified refugees and the advancing iron of a panzer division. The gray light of a winter dawn revealed the bottleneck, where mothers clutched infants and the elderly leaned on canes. Mary Tallgrass watched through her scope, feeling the heavy, metallic thrum of the German tank engines, a sound that felt like a violation of the forest's ancient silence. The refugees were moving too slowly, while the mechanical predators were gaining ground. Mary's orders were simple: observe and report. But as she looked at a small girl in a tattered red coat, she knew that observing would be a betrayal. In a moment of breathtaking bravery, Mary chose to sacrifice her safety to perform a vanishing act. She began to fire, but she did not target the soldiers. Instead, she placed a rhythmic series of shots into the ice-covered trees and rocky outcroppings ahead of the lead tank. The rounds struck with such precision that they created a curtain of splintering timber and falling stone, creating a psychological barrier that suggested a massive ambush was waiting. As the German commander ordered his column to halt, Mary began to sprint through the deep snow. The tank commander, a man used to the invulnerability of steel, began to panic as bullets rang against his hull like hailstones from an angry sky. He couldn't see the shooter, but the rounds were striking with a speed that suggested dozens of riflemen. Mary moved with the agility of a wolf, firing from the left, then the right, then from the high center. She was weaving a tapestry of noise that built a wall of fear between the tanks and the families. For 45 minutes she defied the odds, her lungs burning with the frost as she bought every second with her own sweat and blood. She appeared on one side of the gorge and then the other, firing single shots that struck the metal hatches of the tanks like the hammer of a god. To the men in the valley, the ghost was everywhere at once, a supernatural force commanding the forest to rise against them. For 45 minutes she held an entire armored unit at bay, buying the precious time needed for the last of the refugees to cross the span. By the time the German scouts gathered the courage to storm the ridge, the bridge was empty and the ghost had evaporated into the whiteout. She had saved 300 lives without taking a single one, proving that the greatest power on the battlefield was the will to protect. When the thunder of the artillery finally faded in 1945, there were no ticker-tape parades for Mary Tallgrass. While the world erupted in celebration, she simply leaned her rifle against a damp stone wall and looked toward the west. The government's attempt to document her service was a study in mystery. Intelligence officers found that her file was almost entirely blank. Fearing that her uncanny abilities and her refusal to follow standard protocols would be seen as a failure of discipline, the authorities chose to quietly classify her history, effectively erasing her from the books. Mary's journey home was a long, quiet meditation. She traveled by train across the liberated plains of Europe, watching as farmers began to plow the fields that had recently been battlefields. She saw life returning to the soil and felt a deep sense of closure. When she finally reached the shores of Canada, she didn't wait for a formal ceremony. She took a bus, then a train, and finally a small bush plane that dropped her off at the edge of the muskeg. As the plane's engine faded into the distance, Mary stood alone in the silence of the spruce forest, and for the first time in 4 years, she felt her shoulders truly relax. Mary returned to the Canadian North with the same quiet grace with which she had left. She did not speak of the frozen ridges or the metal giants. She settled back into the rhythms of the muskeg, often carrying the weathered Lee Enfield that the military had somehow let her keep. She lived in a small cabin at the edge of the spruce forest, where the only audience for her stories was the wind. The rifle was eventually wrapped in a soft deer hide and tucked away in a corner of the attic, its brass buttplate sealed tight with resin to protect the secrets hidden within the wood. In the years that followed, Mary became a pillar of her community, known for her healing hands and her ability to predict the weather by the flight of the geese. She never told anyone that she had once stood down a panzer division, but sometimes on the coldest nights of December, she would climb into her attic and run her fingers over the walnut stock of her rifle. She could feel the items clicking inside, the wooden bird, the locket, and the ribbon, the proof that she had stayed true to the deep water under the ice. When she finally passed from this world in the late 80s, she left only the scarred wooden rifle as a silent witness. It sat in the darkness for decades, a forgotten warrior's relic. The family who eventually inherited the estate saw only an antique weapon, never suspecting it was a vessel for a story that would rewrite everything historians thought they knew. It was not until the rifle was brought into the light of an auction house that the true, shocking revelation began to unfold, starting with the realization that the stock was far too heavy for mere wood. Historians' hands trembled as the brass buttplate finally gave way. As he carefully reached into the dark cavity of the walnut stock, he did not find the cold, hard tally of a sharpshooter. Instead, the sterile air was suddenly filled with the faint scent of dried cedar and sweetgrass. What the researchers pulled from the hidden space left them in a state of profound, reverent shock. The first item was the small, hand-carved wooden bird Mary had tucked away, a traditional Cree symbol of a messenger between worlds. Next came the tarnished silver locket containing the photograph of the German child, the one Mary had spared in the ruins. She had kept it as a sacred reminder of the humanity that exists even in our enemies. Finally, they found the delicate bundle of sweetgrass tied with a fraying blue ribbon, the same ribbon she had used to signal mercy to her adversary. Tucked into the ribbon was a prayer for the healing of the land and for the souls of every person who had departed from this world in the cold forest. The ghost of the Ardennes had been a collector of grace. The historian sat in the dimly lit lab for hours, just looking at the items. They realized that Mary had effectively turned a weapon into a peace treaty. Every item told a story of a life preserved, a moment where the mechanical was defeated by the organic. They began to cross-reference the locket with German military records and found that the boy Kurt had actually survived the war, returned home, and lived to see his grandchildren. He had often spoken of an angel in the snow who had spared him with the ribbon. The pieces were finally coming together, revealing a hidden map of compassion that ran beneath the surface of the Great War. The revelation changed everything. The weapon was no longer seen as an instrument of destruction, but as a silent witness to a woman who had walked through the fire without letting it burn away her compassion. She had lived a double life, one of a phantom warrior who struck fear into the opposition, and another of a secret protector who carried the weight of the world's brokenness inside her own equipment. As the news of the discovery spread, the legend of the ghost was replaced by the story of the protector. Mary Tallgrass proved that even within the most terrifying machinery of the human spirit can carve out a sacred space for grace. Her story reminds us that history is not just a collection of dates, but a tapestry of individual choices. The choice to see a neighbor where others see an enemy. The artifacts found within her rifle stock are now housed in a place of honor. But the true legacy of Mary Tallgrass is not something that can be kept behind glass. It lives on in the whispered stories of the refugees whose grandchildren are today because of a single stone bridge. This is the power of a single, quiet life. Mary showed us that even when the world demands that we become hard like steel, we can choose to remain soft like the moss. She showed us that the greatest strength is not the ability to overpower others, but the ability to master oneself. Her rifle, once a tool of the shadows, is now a beacon of the light, teaching a new generation that there is always a way to find peace, even in the middle of a storm. To our friends who have walked through their own long winters, Mary's journey offers comfort. It tells us that our value is not measured by the noise we make, but by the quiet acts of mercy we perform when no one is watching. Like the sweetgrass hidden behind the brass plate, your own kindness is never truly lost. It is woven into the fabric of the world. Mary returned to her woods as a woman at peace, proving that the greatest victory is simply returning home with your soul still intact. The files may remain redacted, but the truth of what happened on that frozen ridge is now out in the open, shining with the brilliance of 1,000 northern suns. As we conclude this story, take a moment to look at the world around you. Beneath the noise and the machinery, there are countless hidden acts of grace being performed every single day. Mary's story is a reminder that we are the keepers of that grace. We are the ones who decide whether the future will be built on fear or on the memory of the light. The files on the ghost of the Ardennes may remain classified, but the truth of Mary's mercy is now yours to carry. If you believe these forgotten stories of human light deserve to be remembered, please like this video and subscribe to join our community of history seekers. Your support is the only thing that keeps these lost voices from fading back into the shadows.